Pro-Palestine campus protests have gotten wall-to-wall coverage from news outlets across the country, including GBH. Journalists have reported story after story about the encampments, clashes with administrators, counter-protesters, and police who've arrested hundreds of students nationwide. But my next guest argues the coverage is focusing on the wrong things. Michigan State University journalism professor Danielle K wrote in The Conversation, quote, "To the media, some elements are more newsworthy than others, with confrontation and spectacle often topping the list." She joins me now. Professor Brown, thank you so much for being available.
It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
Of course. You have a body of work that focuses on activism and social movements and identity. Is that what prompted you to write this piece right now?
Yes. Yes. A lot of my work has focused on the increase of protest activity over the last decade and how it's been portrayed in media coverage. And as the protests on college campuses around the United States have ramped up and continued over the past 6 months, I felt like it was really important to write an article that helped people understand why they weren't seeing the whole story and how that sort of trend plays out across protests over time.
You wrote protest movements can look very different depending on where you stand, both literally and figuratively. And then you go on to say, if you're outside the protest, you really are relying on the media to get the story right and inform you. What does an audience miss when we in the media elect to cover the drama of disruption, as you wrote, without getting to the underlying reasons for a given protest?
Right. So most audiences only see protests when they happen at this big sort of pinnacle point where people are disrupting things and things are very different. Business as usual is not the politics protests are really under. And so you miss a lot of times, especially as an audience member, the opportunity to understand and see the planning process of a protest, the substance of a protest, why a collective of people decided to organize a list of demands or talk to a particular institution. You miss the regular politics, the business as usual part of the politics that typically happen before protests. And so when the media chooses to only cover or initially cover the breaking news of a protest that focuses only on the actions that are happening on a particular day, the general public can't know everything that's happening behind the scenes. We find time and time again, since 2016 all the way through 2023 in various surveys, that only about 5 to 10% of any given population is actually disrupted by a protest, which leaves about 90 to 95% of us relying on someone else to tell us what is really going on. And more often than not, it's the news media that helps people understand what protests are all about.
Were there any specific examples we can learn from that disregarded substance in the case of students looking to shape the conversation around Israel and Hamas and the conflict there?
So a lot of the coverage for the first week and 10 days of national media coverage and local media coverage of these protests on or across campuses, but also on the major broadcast networks, a lot of that coverage is focusing on arrests, chaos, campus crackdowns. There's a love for the letter C, and just the chaos, right? And by doing that, they begin to emphasize the number of arrests. They emphasize the police reports. Sometimes there will be a small paragraph, maybe 1 or 2 sentences that includes information about what the protesters are doing. Usually it's a sentence that says something along the lines of they're encouraging their university to divest, in particular financial stakes, but that's it. And so when people see like an overwhelming amount of information about arrests and chaos and crackdowns, and then have these confrontations that are pictured front and center on pictures, that's really what they tend to walk away with. When more of the narrative focuses on those types of, and leads with, especially in the headlines, those types of words and themes, that's what people are able to take away with most often than not.
I think relatedly, you're also doing work to sort of bridge the gap between media outlets and Black communities that may have some distrust of media because of patterns of misrepresentation. and there's a long history of that before DEIA became trendy in news. But what has your research found about news outlets that get it right when it comes to coverage of protests and social movements? And are any of those insights applicable in this case with campus protests?
Sure. We have found time and time again that community media, media that is immersed in a community, media that is sometimes called alternative media, but that really focuses on a particular group of people that have been underrepresented, not just in Black communities, but particularly in Black communities in my research, that they tend to be able to get it right more quickly than the mainstream news media is able to get it right. And when I say get it right, I mean more fully portray protesters and their substance. They are able to do that a lot quicker. We also find that it's not just an alternative media space. There are individuals inside the mainstream newsrooms that are also embedded in those communities that are able to craft narratives and that are more holistic and then are more representative of a particular group of people. So in my research, we found that some of the most trusted messengers in Black communities are Black journalists. And many of those Black journalists actually happen to be embedded in the very mainstream news organizations that are not typically named as the most trusted sources of news. And so in our research, our team is working really hard to try to figure out how to leverage these trusted messengers and better inform both communities, but also newsrooms about how to get the information they need to create a more holistic narrative quickly.
It sounds like there is some power in assembling a diverse news team. Switching gears a little bit, your piece touches on how official narratives can come to dominate coverage and sort of contribute to a lack of understanding. I'm curious whether you think some of that imbalance is just an inevitable function of who sits where. Like if an elected official who entered office through a major election, a governor, a member of Congress, says anything about protests, I think because of how they came into office, we in the media do tend to latch on to whatever they say. What are your thoughts about that imbalance?
Yeah, journalists, they have a hard time with this. And I did too when I was a journalist. Official sources we have relationships with them as journalists. We've talked to them before. More than likely, they list official statements. When they provide quotes, there is no legal consequence for us repeating them. And so official sources rule almost all of the initial coverage of anything, of breaking news. And it's hard to get away from that, especially in the initial days of any particular event. And so what we have is just a challenge of how do you balance knowing that our official sources, especially our government officials, the university officials, they have a press team that is putting out a narrative and information quickly. It's hard to meticulously vet. And one of the functions of journalism is not just to provide holistic coverage, it's also to provide breaking news so people understand what's going on, the first draft of history, as well as the second, third, and fourth, if you will. And so the official narratives it is part of the journalism's routine, but it is also it creates a complicated space for journalists to work within. Especially when we talk about the protest paradigm, because what we know to be true is that many of the narratives that delegitimize protesters and social movements are created by the sourcing structure that happens within any particular story. And that is because we rely on those official narratives. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of imagining our information sourcing networks, in terms of imagining what could be an official source when a particular group or entity is involved. But certainly the traditional and current function of how journalism is produced is to lean towards official sources, and those do not always have the intentions of holistically representing the people that are there in that community.
I want to turn to public responsibility now, or if you think that there is a public responsibility. And to be fair, time and resources in the industry are sort of limited, and in a large part what we cover and how we cover it is driven by the fact that audiences do respond, and that sort of plays into the money making of our industry. How do we, like the larger we, society, deal with that reality, and what role does the public have in pushing us to explore more nuanced coverage?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the public has to be willing to, one, speak with and talk to journalists. I think they have to be willing to read journalism. I think the audiences need to be more cognizant of what they share and how they share information. And I think that, over time, especially when events like this evolve, we really need audiences and communities and individuals to be invested in keeping up with a topic as it evolves over time, and really understanding that, like, the breaking news is information that's vital and important, but it's not the whole story. And a more complete and robust understanding of any particular issue will only happen if you're willing to think about news as a package of information, and not that one news story can really inform an entire audience of any particular issue or topic.
Lastly, and quickly if you can, because you lift up the old newsroom adage, if it bleeds, it leads. That's the way folks have come to understand how we decide what we cover. It's a good whittling alternative. What would you suggest for newsrooms who are trying to move towards more sharper, nuanced, more informative work?
Well, what I found, especially I was on the ground in Minneapolis after George Floyd was murdered, and what we found when we started tracking sort of social media engagement with particular articles is that there is a lot of engagement with really robust coverage, right? If it bleeds, it leads might work in some scenarios, but also if it's substantive and it gives you this human approach to understanding the nuance of a human being or a group of human beings or an idea, it also creates quite a bit of engagement with audiences. So it doesn't necessarily have to bleed. We don't have to partake in the arrangement of news values as we do. There is evidence that more holistic coverage will also share and be engaging for your audiences, even if it doesn't have smoke and fires on the front page.
Professor Danielle Brown, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.